Thank you for your kind invitation and taking time to hear what's happening in the opposite part of the world. And your interest is very much appreciated and acknowledged by my countrymen. For us, the Baltic Sea region is the home of many beautiful and treasured yachts of the world. And you should know that you have lots of kindred souls in New Zealand as well. What I'm going to do is show you some footage of some recent events we've held in New Zealand. And I have to say, this is just a very small sample of our fleet. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about, first of all, you'll see this footage. I'll talk a bit about geography, just where New Zealand is and how it fits into the world. A bit about its history as a country, but also the development of its yachting. We're quite a young country, but I really want to talk also about why so many of our yachts have survived intact. And most of the vessels you'll see here, the hulls are original hulls, and they are anything from 100 to 130 years old. I'd like to talk about the two main principal families of classic boat builders, the Logans, our most famous, and also their rivals, the Baileys, and finish up by talking about the Classic Yacht Association. So without further ado, I'd like just to play this footage here. Can you just explain to me how I run the footage on this? Do I just push the same button? Okay. I'd like to acknowledge Hummingbird and my good friend Roger Mills for helping putting together this footage and many of the photographs we'll see tonight. A little bit of geography. Welcome to the blue side of the world. New Zealand, as you can see, is probably the largest landmass within the Pacific Basin, and our nearest neighbour is Australia, and it's about 3 hours flight away. So we are quite isolated. But I've also taken the liberty of showing where Helsinki is in terms of its polar opposite. And as you can see, we are your neighbours, your polar neighbours. And I think we'll be a little bit more friendly than some of your other neighbours. This is New Zealand's size compared to Europe, so it gives you some idea of the size of our country. We have a population virtually identical to Finland's, and I understand maybe Finland's a little bit larger in landmass than New Zealand, but we do stretch. We're a long, thin country, and we stretch through quite a lot of latitude, albeit in the south. I'd like to turn to now a little bit of big history about New Zealand. It was the last habitable land to be settled by humans, Antarctica aside. It was settled by East Polynesians in around 1250, and they travelled there on these multi-hulled catamarans that they had built. The Polynesians at the time had no metallurgy. they made these things and sailed these things purely without any metal tools. They're made out of stone tools and natural fibres. They developed their own unique navigation, relying on natural world observations. They travelled tens of thousands of miles across the Pacific. They even reached South America, according to archaeological evidence. They reached as far north as Hawaii and in the north, and New Zealand in the south. And in many ways, and I'm sure you will forgive me, but someone referred to them as the Vikings of the Pacific, but I think I would be doing both Vikings and the Polynesians honour by calling the Vikings the Polynesians of the Atlantic. European settlement occurred in quite a long time later, to be honest. It was first discovered by Europeans, by Abel Tasman of the Dutch East India Company in 1642. And his arrival marked the first multicultural dinner in New Zealand, where Dutchmen were served to the natives. Some 4 generations later, Lieutenant James Cook of the Royal Navy arrived in New Zealand in 1769, and shortly after he was followed by whalers, sealers, traders, timber merchants, and missionaries. And it was some decades later that organised immigration from Great Britain occurred from about 1840. So as you can see, we are quite a young country. It became an independent dominion in 1907. In terms of development of yachting in New Zealand, it was and is a long, thin, mountainous country with difficult communication. So sailing at its foundation was the main form of transport. And within a colonial community, public regattas was the main form of entertainment and an important social event. In time, large prize money was offered. There was much gambling amongst the colonialists on the results, which resulted in many ways in an increase in boat building for specialist fast craft that can win races. And boat building developed in New Zealand, principally around Auckland, and they were influenced by the latest British magazines and books and designs. And so by the 1870s, boat building was firmly established in New Zealand. And 2 of the most famous families in Auckland were the Logan family and Bailey family. And they became the most prominent and became terrific rivals, which helped spur the development of yachting in New Zealand. As we can see here, I mentioned before that competition and prizes help generate new design and new yachts. And the classic period really starts from after the 1870s. The 1870s in New Zealand was a great economic time of depression, but that didn't stop the formation of yacht clubs. And from about the 1880s onwards, we had the classic period up until the First World War. And it was characterized by what we call the Rata Wars. And the Rata was the British measurement system in place during the 1890s, all the way through until the development, really, of the international rule in 1907. I have to say that the international rule didn't find much favour in New Zealand. We'd been sick and tired of our colonial masters changing the rating rules. And so we decided to go our own way and completely ignored the international rule, I think long-term to our disadvantage, to the point where really we only had one or two 6-metre yachts built in New Zealand, a very early one called Scout. And those of you who race in 6-metre yachts might remember a boat called Scout from New Zealand that turned up in your regatta and was probably the oldest 6-metre there. Post-World War II, there was a great deal of home building, much of the yachts in wood, and up until the 1980s with the emergence of more exotic materials. New Zealand didn't compete in the Olympics in sailing until 1956 in Melbourne, where it won gold on its first outing, and it's been a strong Olympic competitor ever since. It has developed into offshore sailing. It won the 1-ton cup in 1969 and 1971, and it became quite a strong competitor internationally during the 70s and 80s and into the America's Cup period, which really steams only for the last few decades. So the question is, why have so many classic yachts? Here's Scout, by the way, the vessel that did come up to this part of the world a few years ago. So the question is, how is it that our classic fleet has survived largely intact? Really has few losses. It's well preserved, And it's pretty unique in the world for its survival. And they're certainly not examples of grandfather's hammer where Dad changed the handle and I changed the head. They are genuinely original vessels. So let's discuss the three main reasons as to why New Zealand's yachts were so well preserved. It's the native timber that was used, the construction method, and perhaps a colonial sense of not wanting to waste anything to repair, to reuse, to recycle. I wouldn't be talking to you today about New Zealand Classic Yachting if it wasn't for these trees. This is the hero of New Zealand yachting, and nobody in New Zealand would dispute this. Meet Agathis australis, otherwise known as kauri. It is a huge timber that can grow up to nearly 1,500 years old, and it produces magnificently straight-grained timber, as you can see from the base all the way up to the top of the bole of the tree. It was heavily milled really from New Zealand's foundation all the way through into recent times. To give some idea of the scale of some of these trees, you can see from the figure in the photograph below how large that they are. Critically, it seems to have a resin within the timber that reacts beautifully with salt water and creates a natural preservative that's been a key in preserving our fleet. I don't think that was understood at the time that kauri was used. It happened to be nice, clear, light timber, and it's just a happy accident that it had this preservative. We recover trees, kauri trees, from swamps and rivers, and these trees are up to 50,000 years old, and they are good timber, to give you some idea of the preservation that it's possible to obtain from these kauri trees. They were milled close to extinction during colonial times, and really it's only late into the 1970s that we saw these trees being protected, and it's now very difficult to obtain kauri. One has to, a bit like John, explore the forest and find an old tree that's fallen over perhaps 200 years ago and get permission to extract that tree and mill it. If you're planning your next yacht on kauri, I'm afraid the news is all bad. They are all protected from export. I'd like to talk also, equally perhaps important, is our construction techniques. Unusually, your vessels are constructed entirely different from ours. We use a triple skin monocoque construction, and what I'd like to do is, it's a bit hard from this drawing. I do have another slide that makes it a bit easier, but as you can see on this vessel here, we have the internal skins are double diagonal and running in opposite directions, and a fore and aft skin. These skins are riveted, copper riveted. We don't have frames. We have a basic floor system and longitudinal stringers. And these yachts have, this type of construction has produced an incredibly strong structure where the support is obtained from the skin and not from the skeleton of the vessel itself. Perhaps it's easy to see for the restoration of this vessel. This is a vessel called Rafferty. You'll see her again in full sailing mode fairly shortly. And hopefully we can see, for example, we can see some of the double diagonals running through here, and you can see here the longitudinal stringers that have been added to the yacht to give it some longitudinal strength. Here we have some floors. They aren't made of kauri, they're usually made of puhutakawa, and we do have to replace those much more regularly, once every 50 or 70 years, because they don't quite last as long as kauri. So it's quite an unusual construction technique, but it has helped produce the longevity of our fleet. The construction technique was brought to New Zealand by the Logan family, which I'll talk about shortly. They were involved, they were a Scottish family. They were employed on the Clyde as shipbuilders. They worked for Steels, where it is believed that they took this technique that was used to build lifeboats for steamers that was transiting the tropics. You can imagine a typical framed and planked yacht going through the tropics, the seams opening up and closing, opening up, to the point where the lifeboat wouldn't be saving many lives. So this technique was often used to build lifeboats and remain usable as the vessel transited the tropics. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Logan family itself. So it consists of a father and sons, largely. This is Robert Logan Sr. As you can see, he lived to a reasonable age. He came to New Zealand in the 1870s and shortly after established his own business, Robert Logan Boat Builders. and he was responsible for establishing the family. He had 5 sons, 3 of which formed Logan Brothers, and they became the most active and leading boat builders of New Zealand and indeed Australasia in this period. They were exporting their yachts to Australia, to the Pacific Islands, and further afield. They had a pretty short commercial life, and they finished up business in 1910 because the land on which they operated was acquired by the government for expansion purposes, and they got a very large payout sufficient for them to just about retire. So sadly for New Zealand Classic Yachting, that we didn't see much of the Logans. Having said that, one of the brothers, Arch Logan, continued to design and do a little bit of boat building work himself. And he in turn had a son called Jack Logan, but he was mainly active in centreboard classes after the war. And just let's have a look at some of the production. So as we can see, an early advertisement here for Robert Logan's boatyard. Here we can see the Logan brothers. Arch Logan is this gentleman here, the principal designer, and let's carry on. In one of their advertisements of the time. So they built not just sailing yachts for pleasure, but they also built steam yachts and what they called oil launches as well. And we saw some of those historic launches that we have as part of our club during the film footage here. So this is probably one of the earlier vessels we have. The earliest Logan vessel we have dates from 1880, and she's still sailing in Auckland. This is Rona. She has been restored a number of times. It was claimed that she was a Watson design, but in talking to William recently, we believe that the Logans probably pitched the design out of Dixon Kemp. Another vessel, Waitangi. I regularly race against Waitangi, a much larger and heavier vessel. She was restored in Australia and then relatively recently acquired and brought back to New Zealand. This is a boat that helped make Logan Brothers' name. This is a boat they built in the early 1890s, a boat called Gloriana. And you'll see some of these names from classic yacht circles being recycled in our country as well. Of course, the Gloriana was a very famous Herreshoff vessel, doing well at the same time in the Americas. Moana, here she is in latter years where she acquired a Bermudan rig over her original gaff rig. This yacht's been in one family for well over 50 years. Thelma, she has berthed next to us on Rainbow. She has a very interesting history, and as an example of how, as a club, we've encouraged others or members of the club to buy boats that are overseas and bring them back to New Zealand where they fall under our protection regime, which I'll talk about shortly. This is my own vessel, Rainbow, and I share this vessel in ownership with Brad Butterworth, America's Cup sailor, as well as Chris Bazade, another quite famous New Zealand sailor, and David Glenn, a friend of ours. Iorangi. Now this is a boat that, please take note of this name because I'm going to talk about her a little bit history a little bit later under another subject. She was built to beat Rainbow. She never did. But she is in Bermudan rig. It's owned by a good friend of mine. He sails it shorthanded with his wife, and it suits his purposes. She's currently for sale, and we're hoping to find an owner who will restore her back to a full gaff original condition. Rafferty. Now this is the boat that we saw earlier when I talked about the type of construction technique we have in New Zealand. As you can see, she's now fully restored and racing around the Waitemata Harbour and the Hauraki Gulf at great speed, and she's a stunningly beautiful yacht. She spent the first half of her life in Australia. After the Second World War, she was purchased by a New Zealander and then sailed back across the Tasman. So you can imagine sailing that in the wilds of the Tasman Sea. It took some doing. It was quite a feat. Araki. Araki is Maori for paramount chief, and a fitting name for a vessel that really ruled Auckland Harbour from her launch in 1904 all the way through to the launch of another boat in the late 1930s, which I will have a picture of. A beautiful boat, recently fully restored. I couldn't avoid not putting in some late Logans. This is a boat called Little Jim. This was my first love, my first boat, and she was a lovely boat. One of the first Bermudan boat vessels to be built in Auckland. Bermudan rigged, and she is regularly seen racing with the fleet. A slightly younger but bigger sister, Tauera, pretty much the same lines as Little Jim. I now want to talk a little bit about the Logan rivals, the Bailey family. They were much earlier to New Zealand in the 1840s. They too had father, son and grandson in various business combinations right the way through the 1860s all the way through to the 1950s. This business, like the Logans, is no longer in operation, but they too designed a number of unique vessels. They too exported their vessels to Australia and around the Pacific. The Logans and the Baileys often launched annually 1 or 2, 2.5 raters and 5 raters, and there was a constant competition that kept the public enthralled as to what the yard would produce for the coming season. Let's have a quick look at some of the vessels that were produced by Baileys. This is a painting of Viking. She's still around, a large pleasure yacht. We don't see her racing too much, but she was largely built for pleasure. Nartera, she's currently undergoing her second restoration, and a lovely little craft, as you can see, 43 feet, which is a fairly typical size yacht for New Zealand. Ida has just recently been brought back from Australia and fully restored. We're very keen to recover our New Zealand yachts from around the world. Just a power launch. Power launches started to spring into New Zealand around about 1905 with the advent of reliable diesel engines, and they used to call them oil launches, and they had an impact in many ways that a lot of people chose to go launching rather than sailing, and it took some decades before sailing re-emerged as our primary sport. Prize, another late Bailey yacht, owned by a strong competitor of mine, and she again is in Bermudan rig. She was changed just after the war, and again that's a vessel that will be returned in time to gaff rig. I'd like to talk a bit about Ranger because she's an example of the New Zealand colonial attitude of build your own yacht. So the Tersel brothers, they were waterside workers. They're kind of working class family, decided they want a boat, so they built in their tiny backyard this enormous 60-foot yacht called Ranger. They launched it in 1938, and they cribbed a design, a Nud Remers design of Balicante. Did I just drop a bit? And it overtook Araki to become the queen of Auckland Harbour right until the late 1960s. And those of you who may have attended the America's Cup Jubilee may recall this vessel which participated in the Jubilee as a representative of New Zealand Classic Yachting. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Classic Yacht Association of New Zealand. As John mentioned, it was formed in the mid-90s. It was formed over a number of restorations, and we felt the classic yachts had been neglected by yacht clubs. It was a situation where the yacht clubs were too focused perhaps on modern, glossy, shiny boats and not so on their heritage. In forming the association, we don't try to replicate our yacht clubs, we work with them, and we encourage ownership and conservation. We have a light touch. We'd far rather a vessel was in a caring hand, maybe not with the budget to do a massive full restoration, but at least the boat is being looked after. A number of our members run what we call our rescue trust. So where a boat was going to be at risk of being lost altogether, it's saved, put in a yard somewhere and preserved, ready until we find a suitable person to own her and get her back on the water. We have a number of categories of classes. We recognise as a classic yacht something that was designed before 1950. It might have been built slightly after 1950, but as long as it was built of wood and designed prior to 1950. After that, we call them modern classics, as long as they're made of wood, and essentially it takes us right up to the 1970s. We do cater for wooden motor launches as well, and we have a fleet of around about 100 yachts and about 75 launches, but this is not all the vessels in New Zealand by any stretch. Not all have survived. We have lost some through export overseas, occasionally the odd wreck, but most of them have. And one final point I want to make is the critical part for us is that When the America's Cup came to Auckland for the first time, I was concerned that the price of our yachts was incredibly cheap compared to overseas classic yachts, and was really worried we could be losing our fleet. So I did some investigation as a lawyer, found out we had an Antiquities Act. I immediately got hold of the government and said, please, can you make sure that we can characterise our classic yacht fleet as antiquities? They agreed, and we had a test case come up within months of doing this, where the boat Rangi, which I pictured before, was illegally exported out of New Zealand knowingly, and it was arrested as illegal trade in antiquities in Sydney. I think the ship's captain thought that they had drugs on board with the amount of police that turned up. But the Rangi was seized by the government. The owner was required to pay a $500,000 bond, and immediately he then returned the boat back to New Zealand, where she was restored. We have a classic yacht regatta every February, March. We had a first wooden boat festival this last month, and please, if anyone is going to find themselves washed up on the shores of New Zealand any time, February, March is the best time for classic yachting, and we're always looking for crew. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hamish.